Bruce Schneier is a security researcher and author of several books, most recently Data and Goliath, The Hidden Battles to Capture Your Data and Control Your World. Bruce, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I'd like to start by talking about your newest book, Data and Goliath. It's about the proliferation of transaction data and how this data is stored and saved and bought and sold. In this title, Data and Goliath, who is Goliath?
Well, Goliath is the data collectors. It's governments and corporations. It's everybody who sits between us and the internet, us and our data. It's our phone companies, it's companies like Google, it's the NSA or whatever country you happen to live in. It's everybody who wants our data.
And what are the motives of these different Goliaths?
Now, there are two basic motives. So, actually, so there's one. The motive is to get power. Data is power. Power for different purposes. If you're a corporation, you want data because it is marketing power, it is advertising power, it is persuasive power. It's power to convince others to buy your stuff, to behave in the way you want. Right? If you are a government, it's more coercive power. Either power to go after criminals, go after political dissidents, go after those whom you don't want to operate freely in society, right? Depending on what country you are, it's good or bad. And there's stuff around the edges, right? Politics, certainly a lot of data collection there. And there it's also persuasive power, it's marketing, but what we're selling is candidates and not soft drinks. But it's the same basic idea.
And the applications for these data, this type of data, are increasing. Facebook recently received a patent to help lenders discriminate against borrowers based on social connections and other social data. What are the consequences of this type of system?
Well, that's not new. We've been hearing about lenders looking at your social connections to see if you're worthy of a loan even before this Facebook patent. And in a sense, it can be a good thing. People in countries without any credit need some way to establish that they are responsible members of society. And one of the ways you can do that is by showing your social network. So there's certainly positives here. But in general, this notion that you are judged by your data can have some very dangerous consequences because it's easy for the data to get it wrong. That being judged by your data can be arbitrary, can be confusing. There's often little ways to correct the record. So there are positives and negatives here.
Speaking of the judgment in the face of data, I'd like to talk some about the Ashley Madison case. This is where a hacker or a group of hackers recently released all of the user data for Ashley Madison, which is a site where married individuals can find each other and commit adultery. And this story is getting increasingly perverse. Yesterday I read that most of the female users are actually robots. Do you have any thoughts on this story and the implications of it?
This is a big deal. And it's not the lasciviousness of it. I mean, it's a news story because it's an adultery site, right? Because the people on there are doing something that is socially considered bad, right? That they are misbehaving. But what this is, it really is a bunch of people sort of being caught in the blast radius of a bigger hack. Hackers went after Ashley Madison for seems like personal reasons against the company, and they, in the process, did a lot of damage to individuals who entrusted their privacy to this site. So this is not the first time we've seen this. Last year, the government of North Korea attacked Sony because of a movie, and they, as part of the attack, published lots and lots of corporate emails. And the press wrote about the CEO emails where he was making racist jokes about President Obama and complaining about his movie stars. A lot of stuff for fodder for the press. But in there, emails of thousands of regular employees doing regular things, having regular conversations with colleagues and friends and loved ones, and their privacy was violated. It's the same thing. They weren't the target. They were an inadvertent victim. All of these Ashley Madison users were inadvertent victims of this hack. And I think this is going to be a increasingly common attack, that this, what I call organizational doxing, someone breaks into a corporate network, steals all the data, and publishes it, is going to become more and more common, and then more of us users, employees, regular people will be hurt because of it.
And so the running hypothesis, like you said, is I think it's a disgruntled employee that was trying to get back at the company. But you could imagine a different scenario where this hack could have been some sort of like anonymous type of group that believed this was such a terrible situation. Males essentially talking to bots that are passing the Turing test and convincing them that they're women. Under that type of circumstance, would you consider this hack more of a Robin Hood type of ethical hack?
But it really depends. It's certainly not ethical to publish the personal data of hundreds of thousands, millions of people. And whether it is a hacker doing it from the outside, right? That was Hacking Team who did that. A hacker published all the data from the cyber weapons arms manufacturer Hacking Team, or a few years ago with HB Gary Federal, whether it's a nation state doing it, which seems to be what happened with Sony, whether it is an insider doing it. Right now, WikiLeaks is publishing an enormous number of cables from the Saudi Arabian government, very similar to Chelsea Manning and the State Department. That might have been an insider, might have been an outsider. These attacks are different people. Right? Insiders, outsiders, governments, individuals, for different purposes. Some of them are more moral than others. I think the Hacking Team was certainly an act of morality. Sony, much less so. Ashley Madison, it's one thing to expose the company's duplicity in a variety of instances. It's another to publish the identities of millions of people who really did nothing wrong and don't deserve this. So I really disagree with the tactic here.
So you think when we look back at this and think about it as a watershed event in security, if we do think about it that way, it seems the motif that you're thinking about is that it's this idea of a blast radius where these people that were not necessarily the intentional victims of the hacking become victims.
And this is increasingly going to be a problem. Right now we're living on an internet where our data is elsewhere. And this is relatively new. 5-10 years ago, my email was on my computer, our documents were on our computer. Now, Google Docs, we use internet email providers, our calendar, our address book, all of our photos, all of our stuff is elsewhere. So we're forced to rely on these companies for our security. Right? Remember the Apple hack of the photo archive from last year? That only happened because everyone stores their photos in the cloud. If the photos were on our computers, that wouldn't have happened in the same way. So yeah, we are all entrusting our security to these companies that we don't truly understand, that might not have our best interests at heart.
What about these bots? When humans are fooled by bots that are masquerading as romantic partners, is this a security breach? Has our romance been securely breached?
I don't know. To me, this is part of the lasciviousness of the story. There are lots of bots out there. They're used for helping people shop, and that people can be fooled by romantic bots. That's someone else's story. I don't think it's making it a security story. I think is really stretched. But this is the thing that's going to get the press, right? This is the titillation part of this story. But I think Certainly. The real part is the data. And it could have easily been data that's just as personal but not as lascivious. Right? Data about which diseases you're searching. Data about your mental health. Data about your physical health. Right? Data about your loves. This could be a regular dating site.
What is the difference between security and privacy?
It's not an odd question. They're different words. They're related concepts. I'll go back to you. What's the difference?
Well, security I would think of as something that enforces your privacy. Security is the layer that protects your privacy, I guess.
So that's a good answer. So privacy is a thing you want, right? That you want your data, your information. Privacy has a lot of different attributes, but you want privacy, and security is a way you get it. You get it through security. Other things you might want are safety and security is a way you might get that. So security is a mechanism, and privacy is an end state. Now, these are very, very overloaded words. I mean, any definition I give like that, you're going to find exceptions. I said we want to be safe. People also say I want to be secure. So security ends up being a process. It's also an end state. They're very overloaded words, and I always find if someone asks, like, what's the definition of X, it's almost looking for trouble, because you're never going to find a definition that's truly satisfying, because they are such core concepts and such complex concepts.
A year and a half ago, you wrote an essay called "It's Time to Break Up the NSA." Do you still feel the same?
Yeah, I do. And so I'll give you the major problem. The NSA has two very different missions. Basically, protecting our stuff and attacking their stuff, very, very broadly. And those missions made sense to be together during the Cold War, because our stuff and their stuff were different. That you could attack a Soviet radio and defend an American radio, and it was the same technology, and when you did one, it didn't affect the other. Now the world is different. Everybody's stuff is the same. We're all using TCP/IP and Cisco routers and Microsoft Office and Chrome browsers. We're all using the same stuff. And there isn't an attack theirs, defend ours dichotomy in the same way. And so these two NSA missions are now hurting each other. That when you attack theirs, you by definition leave ours vulnerable. When you defend ours, you by definition defend theirs. And so I think this should be broken up. The core NSA, espionage, is a perfectly reasonable thing that needs to be done. And the NSA should focus on that. Government on government espionage.
So
let me go through the rest.
Sure.
Government on individual surveillance is a police matter, rightfully belongs in an FBI-like organization, probably the FBI. And cyber defense really should be pulled out of the NSA and put into a much less secret, much more focused defense organization. Right? And the one piece sort of missing there is the attack piece, which is now and rightfully belongs in U.S. Cyber Command by part of the military.
Is that who originated Stuxnet?
I don't think we know exactly which organization originated Stuxnet. See, right now the NSA and Cyber Command are very commingled. They are separate politically, but they are both in Fort Meade, both run by Admiral Rogers. So it's often hard to figure out what came from where. Stuxnet, I'm sure, was a Cyber Command operation, but when you say the word originated, I don't think we know it all.
When you think about Stuxnet, I mean, it seems like the type of thing that would take so much complex coordination between different branches of the military and of the government. It almost necessitates there being a tight commingling between the NSA and the Cyber Command.
Well, it's sort of an interesting question. What they will say is because the technical expertise is so related that they need to be close. And that makes sense. If you think about the difference between what the government calls CNE, computer network espionage, and CNA, computer network attack, it's all the exact same steps up to the very end, which is either copy star.star or delete star.star. Right? So they are exactly the same. But politically and legally, they're very different. And the reason you want to separate them is because they're very different tools from a policy perspective. And having them close, I think, muddies that. But you're right that technically they are basically the same.
How did Stuxnet affect your perspective on cyber war?
I don't know if it did. It certainly is an example of it, but it's not an example that is surprising in any way. Right? It really is the first military-grade cyber weapon we saw launched. But it wasn't science fiction. It wasn't surprising. It was kind of regular. It's a good example. It's a good story to talk about. I don't think it really changed thinking that much.
Well, do you think it changed thinking in the internal government military discussions? Because it's certainly easier for you and I to say, oh yeah, this, we could have seen this coming, but maybe the people in Washington were like, wow, no blood was shed, but we accomplished exactly what we wanted to do. Do you think it changed the tenor?
I think it did, because it demonstrated the power of a cyber weapon. And you're right, it was largely successful. There was some collateral damage. There were networks around the world that were affected by Stuxnet, but not a lot. You could argue that was successful. But it really did demonstrate that a targeted cyber weapon could achieve the same goals that a missile strike or a bombing run could, with less loss of life and less other damage. So in some ways, I think that was a really good demonstration, not just in the U.S., but around the world.
Were there corporations involved in the creation of Stuxnet?
We don't know. Probably not. It does seem that the government had assistance from Siemens, which is the company that built the controllers that Stuxnet attacked. But it's unclear that Siemens knew exactly what they were assisting. We don't know about any contractors that were involved in the building of Stuxnet, so that's unknown. There probably were, simply because there's a lot of contracts inside the NSA, inside Cyber Command. A lot of non-government employees are doing this work, but we do not know of any corporate involvement in any detail.
How far do you think we are from a world where Google and Amazon become very active as military contractors?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think they are, almost by definition, not trying to. Becoming a military contractor is surprisingly difficult, and I've worked with military contractors. It's kind of its own thing. You have to have the expertise to navigate the military government contracting process, and that is a unique skill set. It is, if companies like Google and Facebook are doing military work, they are likely doing it through some other contract. Like, I'm going to make this up. Raytheon has the government contract, and Google works for Raytheon. That really feels not likely. We know there's cooperation between government and those companies, probably mostly under duress, under actual coercion, because the companies really do have a strong image in not cooperating with the government. For example, we know that Facebook shares its photos with the FBI. We know that Google responds to lots and lots of legal wiretap requests every year. But I just don't see them getting into the military-industrial complex business because it's such a separate business.
Let's say you have Google spin up a data center to support the Skynet of the U.S. government, though. Does that border on becoming a military contractor, or is it a segregation of concerns enough?
It does, but again, I don't see them doing that because it's not just as easy doing the tech. It's understanding the paperwork, and the paperwork's the hard part.
Interesting.
And they're not government paperwork companies, so certainly they could provide assistance to the General Dynamics contract that's doing that. But I just don't see them as being government contractors. It's such a different world.
I mean, I agree with that, but also building a data center is such a difficult process, and the military is going to be increasingly powered by these data centers, and you'd think Google or Amazon or whoever else is going to be exponentially better at doing these data centers than Raytheon.
Maybe, I don't know. Who's building the Utah data center for the NSA? It's not Google, it's not Facebook.
Fair enough.
And I'm not convinced this data center building expertise is so rare. And these really feel, big data, the NSA has been doing big data since before big data was big data. So yes, there's a lot of expertise in the corporate world, but there's a lot of expertise in the government too. And yes, right. I'm sure that if there was this massive contract to build a government data center, and there are government data centers, the big contractors would get expertise from these companies. But I don't know if, how they do it is feels more likely to be done within the traditional government channels.
Got it. So the things that we do know these corporations like Google are doing is that there has been, obviously documents released that have shown how some ways that they are expanding the government's surveillance net. We started to see these documents a while ago with Snowden closures. Where are we today? How have things changed? How are corporations working with the government to expand the surveillance net?
So, with fits and starts, and it really depends on which industry. We know, for example, that there's enormous cooperation between AT&T and the NSA. This was the subject of a ProPublica New York Times story a few weeks ago, and we've seen a lot more of it in the Snowden documents. But there's enormous cooperation between telcos and the NSA in the UK, between BT, British Telecom, and the UK's NSA, a lot of cooperation. And they've been cooperating through the Cold War. This cooperation isn't new. And this cooperation is, let us tap your lines, let us access your facilities, let us access things you're doing in other countries. There's a lot of that cooperation. There's less so with more of the modern data aggregators, the Facebooks and the Googles, who don't really come from that tradition of government cooperation and are fighting more, although their data is used a lot by government, either through coercion or through theft or any of the other bribery, any of the other ways government gets at this data.
So this type of coercion, how does this manifest? Is it like the government just basically coerces them and then comes into a Google data center or a Facebook data center and says, hey, you have to make this, you have to plug in this wire here. Is it at that level, or where exactly is this coercive change in engineering happening?
Well, it's going to depend, and we see examples of all of it. We see, asking nicely. NSA going to AT&T and saying, hey, can we plug this into your data center? AT&T is saying, sure, put it in that closet over there, don't tell anybody. We see bribery. NSA going to RSA Security and saying, here's $10 million, we want you to make this algorithm a default. We see threats. And then we see actual legal compulsion, whether it's the FBI going to an ISP and saying, give us this data, to more general, make these changes in your systems. So it's really kind of all over the map, and different tools are used, and I'm sure they're targeted against different companies.
Are we seeing Snowden-like actors come out of corporations that say, hey, we've been strong-armed into doing stuff, and here's the proof behind it, we don't like it?
We aren't seeing many. We are seeing a lot more. Nobody's big as Snowden. Snowden's a once in a lifetime, because we got so much. But there are many people leaking government documents in the United States. Many is like maybe a half a dozen. I kind of try to keep track, but it's very hard. Who are not Snowden. Some of these could easily be corporate employees. We don't know, right? Snowden was a corporate employee. But no one that big. We haven't seen a major whistleblower sort of hear all the documents. The closest we've seen is the outsider, we believe, who went into Hacking Team. Hacking Team is a cyber weapons arms manufacturer, sells surveillance and attack weaponry to a lot of countries. I'll give you the list, and you say, these guys shouldn't really have this sort of stuff. They use it for human rights violations, to arrest people, for torture, bad stuff. And that person broke into Hacking Team, released everything. Right? So that's similar. That seems to have been an outsider, not an insider. We haven't seen a major whistleblower from a U.S. defense contractor.
So if you're an engineer at one of these companies that the U.S. government has interest in getting the data from, how do you determine whether or not something you are doing is ethical or unethical? I just imagine being an engineer in a spot kind of like in Snowden's spot, and where he's like, I'm being asked to do these things. It doesn't feel totally legitimate. Do you have any tips for how to develop a philosophy that is sort of strong enough to understand where the breaking point between your personal ideology and the requirements of your engineering job lie?
You know, it's a good question, but it's not really a question for me. You basically asked me, how do I get a moral compass? I don't know, right? I mean, talk to a philosopher, talk to a psychologist. I don't know how to get a moral compass. It's something people should have. I'm a fan of moral compasses, but I don't have expertise in how to develop one.
So you are not a philosopher. Are you more of a reporter? Do you see yourself as a reporter?
See myself as a technologist. Right? I mean, my background is cryptography. My background is math, computer science, into computer security. And really only lately in my career have I moved into the economics of security, the psychology of security, really now the sociology and politics of security. But no, I've never been I've taken philosophy classes in college, but I've never been a philosopher. It'd be fun to be one.
Well, the philosophical reasoning in these types of situations oftentimes does seem rooted in math, though, because a lot of times you can say, oh, well, syllogistically, A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. Obviously, D is an economic scenario we want to avoid, therefore we should avoid A altogether. And A is sometimes something that, seems totally unrelated, particularly in the engineering world where things are really complex. And so, yeah, I don't know. I agree it's a difficult question. So maybe it doesn't make sense.
I will defer to you. That sounded interesting and okay all at the same time. I will defer.
Okay, defer. But let's talk about the engineering then. What are some best practices? What are some things engineers should keep in mind when building secure systems?
So there's another question I'm going to duck. Not because it's a bad question, because the last thing what they should keep in mind is do not listen to advice on radio shows on the internet. That this is complicated. This is hard. People get graduate degrees in this stuff, and to keep in mind that a little bit of advice picked up here and there is not going to be enough. I mean, keep in mind that this is hard. And I'm asked all the time on interviews, what are the 5 tips for this? What are the 6 ways to do that? Right? That any one of these lists is bad. Any one of these, here's how to be safe, is going to be incomplete. And what we're learning again and again and again is this is subtle and complicated. And if you think you've got it right, you better know why you think that. Because it's hard.
It's funny. The first interview I did this week was with a guy who's helping to build a cryptocurrency system called Ripple, and I asked him about security principles. And he's like, don't do too much. Don't assume that you know something when you may not know it. It's basically just like assume humility and essentially the same thing you're saying. So,
and those are good principles. I mean, certainly. And what we learn again and again is that security is less about what you think of and more about what you didn't think of.
Right.
So this makes this hard.
You wrote yesterday about a internet-enabled refrigerator for man-in-the-middle attacks. I had a conversation with Vint Cerf, who is a Turing Award winner, this internet pioneer, and he said he was worried about refrigerators launching a denial-of-service attack on a bank in the future. Have you thought about this type of scenario? Like, how would this attack play out?
Well, not refrigerators per se, but it's things. And this is something that Cory Doctorow said. I think he put it very well. We moved from a world of things to a world of computers that do things. So a refrigerator isn't actually a refrigerator anymore. It used to be. Now it's a computer that keeps things cold. Right? Your car is a computer with 4 wheels and an engine. Your smartphone is a computer that makes phone calls. Your thermostat is going to be a computer that keeps your house's temperature regulated. And all of these are computers. And as computers, they have all the power of regular computers, just probably without the screen and the keyboard. And they have all the vulnerabilities of regular computers. So just as a hacker can build a zombie network of computers to attack a bank, a hacker can build a zombie network of other things to attack a bank. And those things will include refrigerators and toasters and thermostats and all the Internet of Things things. And because they are much more limited use, much lower cost, much more poorly designed, etc., they're likely to be much more vulnerable. So when Vint Cerf says he's worried about his refrigerators attacking a bank, what he's really saying is this proliferation of embedded low-cost computers that people aren't paying attention to are just as vulnerable as the big computers and can be used for the same things.
And are there, this may come back to the same type of philosophical thing that you'll defer, but is there a way we can defend against this type of attack or anticipate it or build processors, build IoT systems that are not susceptible to this type of thing?
Oh, lots of ways. You just don't like them because they're expensive. I mean, this is the problem. These devices are made to be low cost. They're made to be small and cheap. I mean, nobody wants to have a computer-like design process. Now, a lot of these devices have no update path. Your home router likely cannot be updated. It has vulnerabilities that cannot be fixed. The way you update your home router is you throw it away and buy a new one, which is kind of unacceptable. I mean, right now, what is this multi-million car factory recall, I forget which company, because they have to update their software, and the way they have to do it is in the factory, at the dealer. Right? Tesla cars had the same vulnerability. They pushed an upgrade over the air to all their cars while people were sleeping. Like, that's the difference, that these devices just aren't built with this kind of security lifecycle in mind. I mean, of course, we could do it, but we have to recognize that we want to do it, and we have to recognize that it's important to do it, and we have to be willing to pay to do it. And so far, we haven't shown any of that willingness.
When we put these processors in refrigerators and cars and thermostats, are we increasing the attack surface? Are we increasing our vulnerabilities faster than we're improving our utility?
You know, I'm sure we're improving utility even faster. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't be actually doing this. We are definitely increasing our attack surface. We're increasing vulnerabilities. I mean, this vulnerability I talked about earlier this week, where the Samsung refrigerators had a interaction with your Google account and caused a vulnerability, right? I mean, there's an interaction between two things. But the utility of these computers is so great, whether it's a Nest thermostat or a computerized car. I mean, some of it's kind of weird. I mean, the refrigerators that know when we're out of milk, and it gets a little esoteric. But a lot of this is very valuable. I mean, I don't think we are increasing our risk faster than we're increasing our utility, but we are definitely increasing our risk.
I want to come back to Data and Goliath and related topics. What role do human analysts play in the comprehension of these big data collective processes? Do we still need manual human analysts?
Depends what you define by need. It depends on your purpose. So, I mean, the data is collected for a lot of reasons, and you have to look at the error rates. Right? Facebook, Google collect an enormous amount of data, and they use that to deliver personalized ads. No humans are involved in analyzing that data. And honestly, if they have a 1/3 error rate, so what? Right? It's still better than showing an ad to everybody. So advertising can tolerate a very high error rate. If it is approving a loan, the error rate you want is a lot less. A 1/3 error rate would be a disaster. So maybe you have a fully automated process that has exceptions that are looked at by people. Now, on the other hand, the government might use this data to launch drone strikes and figure out who to kill. For that, a false positive is actually really, really bad, and there you're going to need a human in the loop every time. So it depends a lot on who's using the data and for what purpose. There'll always be ways where the data is used fully automatically, and there'll always be ways where the data needs some kind of manual check, intervention, massaging, or something.
So this show is typically about software engineering. We've been talking more about kind of the higher level implications. Do you have any idea how the level of engineering savvy at a place like the NSA or Booz Allen compares to a place like Google?
I think it's interesting. There is a lot of expertise in both places. Certainly, the NSA is going to have attack expertise that corporate America doesn't have because, we don't need it. Defensive expertise, I think, it will be strong in both places. I'm not convinced that the NSA will have any secrets that a Google won't. But there are certainly differences. We see this in the NSA documents, that the attack tools the NSA are building are very sophisticated because they actually have budget and manpower at attack tools, which, we don't.
We've seen the PowerPoints for these back-end data collection and processing systems. I'm curious how well implemented those systems are, because I can't tell you how many specs for systems within corporations where it's like, oh yeah, the spec looks great, and then you look at the engineering behind it, you're like, this is not up to the spec. So do you think that...
We don't know. We have no idea.
Yeah.
We just don't see the details. The thing we know most about is XKeyscore. We've seen the structured query language. We've seen really a lot of the guts on how that works. It looks very well designed. But we just don't have enough visibility into the details to know how well the things work in practice.
Let's talk a bit about XKeyscore. It's such a good specific example. There was a movie recently that came out, the Citizen 4, and they talk a lot about XKeyscore in it. What is XKeyscore?
XKeyscore is basically a database. It seems to be a database of databases. That it is a singular database plus query language plus data visualization console that will allow an NSA analyst to query individuals, keywords, to look for people with certain characteristics. It seems to be the most sophisticated query tool NSA analysts have. When Snowden in the beginning, he would said something like, "From my desk, I was able to spy on anybody, including the president." Or something like that, he said. And it was wildly dismissed. He was talking about XKeyscore. And the more we see about it, the more we see he was right. That from his desk, he was able to do all of that. And that was using XKeyscore. It keeps a rolling buffer of data. Of course, it can't store everything. There's just too much of it. So data is stored for 30 days, 60 days, longer if it's certain kinds of data. But it allows the analyst to do very complex queries. I was looking at some of the reports we've seen. It's things like, tell me anybody from Syria who searches for these websites from 2 to 4 in the morning. Right? I want to know everybody who talks between the Ukraine and Moscow using PGP. Those sorts of things you can query with XKeyscore.
So this conflict that is kind of developing between the U.S. and ISIS, how do you see this conflict? It seems like almost like a social media battle, but also, an information battle. Could you give a primer on how the U.S. is approaching the ISIS conflict?
I certainly can't. I'd love to hear one, though. This is certainly a big issue. I can tell you where to go to get one. I've been listening to the talks from the Aspen Security Forum, which occurred in August, and some extremely high-level administration officials in counterterrorism, in law enforcement, current, former, talking a lot about things, including the ISIS threat. And they are talking a lot about this. I don't have anywhere near their expertise, but I would sort of urge listeners who are curious to go pull down the videos of the Aspen Security Forum talks and panels. They're really interesting.
I will definitely put those in the show notes. But from what you've heard, or maybe you just don't want to talk about this at all, but do you think that this is like this ISIS stuff is the type of thing where the NSA's tools actually have a practical use, and we're going to say like, oh wow, it's pretty good. We're glad we have these things.
NSA tools have a lot of practical use. Spying on foreign leaders is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Espionage is important. It's an important tool of statecraft, and we shouldn't minimize it. So I never minimize the NSA's tools. The question is really the targets. Against ISIS, I don't know what the NSA is providing. NSA doesn't really talk about it, but I'm sure there's a lot of good intelligence, both strategic intelligence and tactical targeting intelligence. Who do we drone is going to largely be NSA determined.
Right. So I'll begin to close off. Have you had any big philosophical changes about your beliefs in security in the last 10 years?
I'm now min-maxing your number, which of course
sure,
is
5 years.
The question. 5, 10, 12. Really, my career has been a series of generalizations. And again, I started out in cryptography, then computer security, network security, more general security technology. Lately I've been thinking about economics of security, maybe 15 years ago. Started writing about the psychology of security 10 years ago. And my latest works are the sociology of security, is 2010, Liars and Outliers. And my latest book is really the political science of security and privacy. So it's really my attempts to sort of figure out what's going on, to generalize and understand what's happening. And if there's anything, that's really the changes.
And what's next along that arc? What will your next book be about?
I never know before I write it.
How does that writing process work? Is it just you sit down and you write paragraphs and paragraphs, and then all of a sudden you realize, oh, I'm writing a book, and this is a topic I'm interested in?
Well, I usually set out to write a book, but it's never the book I set out to write. For me, writing a book is exploring a topic. So I will write with a topic in mind, but often what I get will end up being different. I don't write front to back. I write what I say is bottom to top, which is I write pieces everywhere, and then I keep moving them around, trying to find the story, find the narrative. And it often takes me about half of the way through the book before I understand truly what the book is about. And then I just keep adding stuff all over until I'm done.
I think tech journalism, or whatever you want to call what you do, tech analysis, I think it's a growing and it's an important topic, and that's kind of why I spend a lot of time doing it. I'm curious. I think you're really good at it. Do you have any suggestions for ways to be a responsible and informative and entertaining and good researcher of technologies and journalist of technologies?
I don't know. I don't consider myself a journalist. It sort of reads oddly when you say you're a good journalist. I think of myself as a technologist, someone who does technology and writes about it only secondarily. Right? So I'm a doer and secondarily a writer. I'm also a good explainer, which I think is why my writing resonates so well. I don't have any good advice because I didn't go down that path. I sort of just stumbled on this. It's what I do.
So just a couple more questions. What is the most important security topic on your mind that we have not discussed?
What an interesting question. I don't know. I tend to flitter about. I don't really have important topics on my mind. Right now I'm trying to write about cameras and face recognition. That just happens to be this week. That's not an important topic. I think we hit the Internet of Things, which is important. We hit public-private surveillance partnerships, which is important. We talked a bit about security and power and some of this organizational doxing and cyber conflicts. So I think we're hitting the good topics.
Did you see this recent thing where it was like 250,000 iPhones that were jailbroken recently? Flashed a screen to the user that said you cannot use this iPhone anymore until you pay a ransom?
I did not. That's interesting. So we're seeing more ransomware. It's now prevalent on computers. I didn't know it was coming to cell phones, but again, why not, right? They're just computers.
Right. Yeah, okay, so real quick, what are your thoughts on walled gardens? It's interesting, you get your iPhone, you've got the walled garden, you decide to tear it down to jailbreak your iPhone, and then all of a sudden it's susceptible to ransomware. Is this proof that the walled garden approach is a good idea, and or does this just mean that maybe the walled garden approach is a bad idea because once you tear it down, everything's out the door?
The walled garden has pluses and minuses. It has certainly security pluses. It's not perfect, and like anything, if it's breached, it's breached. I don't really think it's a referendum on the walled garden.
Okay, sure. And final question: why don't you write much about Bitcoin?
Oh, gadzooks, because there's a lot to learn about. It's funny, I have about a dozen papers printed in my computer bag right now on Bitcoin and how it works and some of the interesting things. And I think I have finally something to say about it, which really is its fragility. That what we're learning is that Bitcoin is being broken not by the math and cryptography being broken, but by the stuff around it. People having hacked Bitcoin wallets and hacked Bitcoin exchanges. And all of these things around the Bitcoin protocol that you need to make it work are the weak links. And it turns out that having a a currency without a government backing it up is risky. And I think that'll probably be the first essay I'm going to write about Bitcoin. And it really has been. I haven't had a lot to say. It's been a huge learning curve, and I wasn't sure I wanted to go down it. But I finally think I have something that no one said before, so I am thinking about writing something about Bitcoin.
That's great. I can't wait to read that. And I did a week of shows on it, and I think kind of what you're saying is true and interesting. It's like you have this utopian decentralized platform, and then organically pockets of centralization develop, and then those are instantly the vulnerabilities, and they make the system insecure. It's funny. So
right, and in some ways, it's a lesson that as much as we try to get away from centralization, that we need it even around the edges.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, that's a great place to stop. Bruce Schneier, thanks so much for coming on Software Engineering Daily. It was a real pleasure talking to you, and I'm a huge fan of your work, so keep it up.
Oh, thank you.